The rules that most people seem obsessed with are related to one topic. For some reason, people love talking about sex, and morality is intertwined with sexuality.
Thinking about the subject of sex can be quite legitimate. You are doing so now. It depends on what you do with your thoughts and why. Better dismiss the whole matter at once and for good, or simply say that you were troubled with bad thoughts and accuse yourself of any guilt that there may have been in God's eyes.
Seems like God or religion is very interested in human sexual behavior.
Yes, because sex is our biggest drive, our naughtiest thing, the thing which think of the Puritans. We can really get someone and get them by the short hairs and make them do what we want.
If you want to control human beings, you control their sexuality. And the church learned that a long time ago. You control the sexuality of people and you've controlled them for life.
Any society that wants to control, first of all, puts the women at their place according to them. Because when you control, you want to control the vulnerable, the weak, the dependent, and they have found women for centuries physically weaker. So they controlled them. They enslaved them.
So the first male walked up, the first female goes, come on, baby, let's do it. And she said, you smell bad, you're ugly, you're stupid. Let's talk. We're not going to do it just yet. So the male is confounded. I mean, he has never met a female with a mind of her own before. This is something new in the animal world. So he has to figure out how can he break down her resistance? How can he get her to say yes? The single most burning question for any man is, what does a woman want? Which really translates into, what must I do to get her to say yes to sex?
If you look at the non-human primates, like the bonobos, for instance, and the chimpanzees, you see that women play a huge role in mediating chimpanzee politics. They pry the male fingers away from the stone that he's about to heave at some other chimpanzee. And they quiet them down with sexual favors. That's the usual way of diffusing violent situations. And that's something that's not entirely unknown to human beings.
I think in the tribal environment, sexual behavior meant property, it meant insurance for the future, it meant guaranteeing that your offspring and your offspring's offspring were related enough to you that you continue to do favors for them. So that caused us to regulate sexuality.
If our sexual behavior was not controlled by the guidelines of Almighty God, then imagine my sister walking on the street and somebody would like to have sex with her. Where do you put a limit?
The reason we have jealousy is because we want to ensure that our genes are really ours in our offspring going on to the next generation. And so religion really grafted onto moral emotions that were already there from evolution.
Why Western people are obsessed with sex? Sex is nothing. It's a part of a process. Because of our guilt, we give a significance to it. So when you love, can you think of having sex? Well, you can. But when you have sex, can you love? You say yes. But it may not be true. Sex could be a very minor, crude instrument for propagation, for proximity of gametes. It has got nothing to do with romanticism. But then we make it romantic, otherwise you feel devaluated.
Why would God be interested in our sexual behaviors? And of course today with overpopulation, if God were really a planner, if God were really someone who cared about the perpetuation of the species, and for us to not ultimately, overpopulate the planet and use up all our resources, wouldn't God be in support of non-traditional practices, whether they're practices of homosexuals or of gay, lesbian, or straight couples adopting? Wouldn't He be more supportive of these non-traditional practices?
God is very concerned about our sexual behavior. It is a major issue with God. And so we need to warn people that the wages of sin is death. We don't put people to death, of course, for adultery today, but we warn them that ultimately they will go to hell, whether it be for fornication, adultery or homosexuality.
Gee, isn't that funny? You can actually create an entire universe and you've got nothing better to do but worry whether people are putting their hands in their pants. Does that seem a little fishy? I mean, shouldn't that be the first crack in the edifice? Isn't it the first thing that makes you wonder, could this really be so that he cares so much about our sexual behavior? Of course, he doesn't. We do. And so we project onto God the very things we're most concerned about. Now, we are rightfully concerned about sexual behavior. Sexual behavior is the key to reproduction, and reproduction is the very thing that any organism that evolved is here to do. We regulate our sexual behavior as both individuals and as cultures and as a species for very good reason. But we project these moral rules onto God because, it's very hard to convince somebody not to have sex if they don't think anybody's looking.
For some religions, actually, sexuality is a way towards spirituality. And we see this a lot with tantric yoga and so forth, that it's a way of getting into those kinds of spiritual states.
In Satanism, sex is like eating. It's a natural human function. We Satanists feel we are gourmets in our experience of the world.
Well, sexual matters have always been of great interest in Druidic culture because what we now refer to as the psychosexual revolution, or the understanding that lovemaking and sex can be part of a religious experience, is very ancient in the world.
Some men are more privileged than others. Solomon and David, they could have sex a lot more than the average Joe in the Old Testament because they had so many more wives and concubines, and apparently God was okay with that.
Christianity came, and when they saw the Indian people, we weren't ashamed of our bodies. There was no shame in the sexuality. A lot of our stories, the sexual stories, they explain things about different things we had in the old days, but they also make you laugh. In the language, it's not dirty as English. English is a very dirty language, but in a Paiute language, it's really expressive and it really makes you laugh. Everybody had a good time. It was natural. And when the Christians came, they started telling us that's all wrong. You need to cover your bodies and be ashamed of it. You need to be ashamed of sexuality. You need to be ashamed because that's not God's teaching. And we come to find out that was a man's teaching.
Someday I'd like to write a book about all the great religious figures. They were nuts. I mean, St. Augustine and St. Jerome and these people who gave us original sin and that said that sex is evil and dirty and you shouldn't, it's got to be done in the dark under covers only for procreation. These people had troubled lives themselves. And the fact that they became the leaders of religion and that taught the rest of us how we're supposed to behave is one of the great stories that needs to be told someday. A lot of these people were very disturbed people.
In the area of sexuality, we just had there's just been a lot of misconceptions, like even St. Augustine, who's a great saint and a wonderful theologian, had I guess a lot of it coming out of his own experience of having an illicit relationship, that having sexual intercourse, even with a couple, was at least partly sinful. I guess it was just so powerful and overwhelming or something, and took over his life, as a matter of fact. And he had a child out of wedlock and all that sort of thing. So he passed on that sort of sense of it's being a negative experience, a negative factor. And I think we're working our way out of it.
If it wasn't for sex, we just probably wouldn't stay together very long for most of us, because it helps us soothe through those things of disagreements. I've heard of one pastor who told when he goes to marriage counseling, he said, go home all this week, I want you to have sex every night and come back and let's talk about your problems then. And most of them are worked out in that week.
如果一个人不结婚或者不生育子女，这个孔子来讲，对他来讲，这是不可理解的。这是你没有尽到你对天地的责任，还不要说你对这个父母、对这个家庭延续这个的责任。
Anybody having a slightest desire can have a sex, but we don't have it because we put some value. And basic value is God restricts us. God only permits two persons to have sex when they feel they are in love. It's a strange, primitive sense. Sex is a necessity, is instrumental for procreation.
In Chinese tradition, the more children we have, the more happier we will be in future. That's our thinking.
Oh, so it's very difficult now if you're limited to 1 or 2 children.
Yes, yes.
You know, it's an interesting fact that the people who are most, puritanical about sexuality are also the ones who tend to reproduce the most.
I think this experience, this very room, my body, everything around me, you listening to these words, is the experience of God having sex with itself.
God is the free unfolding of our sexuality. And so, what you do with your movement has to come at a certain point from your own choice. You can't wait for permission to decide how you're going to move this moment. All of existence is determining that. And all of existence at once is, as we've already said, God.
There's just two things. The Holy Spirit and sex is the two things on the face of the earth. And the world couldn't operate without them two things. No way it could operate.
Do I have thoughts on sex before marriage?
Yeah. Should people have sex before marriage?
Well, I think probably, yeah. Probably a good idea. They should know what they're getting into.
It's kind of inevitable. If you're really committed, if you truly love the person.
Well, we certainly did.
This isn't a question that normally comes up because everybody already does. So, it's like asking, should people eat?
I can't speak on this topic because I'm not married at all. I never speak on topics which I have not had experience myself.
How do you feel about premarital sex?
I endorse it.
Oh, absolutely. Well, not absolutely, but I think that's a personal choice. I don't think there's anything wrong with it.
I have no idea about marriage and sex. No idea.
Faculty of sex is given by God to be exercised within the state of marriage for the sake of bearing children who will have two parents and a stable family environment. And they think that just sex for the sake of sex is like eating for the sake of eating rather than for the sake of nourishment.
A person should have sex as soon as he feels the inclination to have it and can find a consenting partner.
就是他谈的一种自然，食和色是一种自然的人的欲望，但是对这种欲望，他谈的要克制。
होंगे उसको कंट्रोल करके फिर सन्यासी रहते हैं 3 साल 3 महीना अंदर ही रहते हैं.
You know, lots of people fall in love with priests, but the priest would never think of having a coital relationship with them. We use who we are to develop the way we exercise ministry. We use our sexuality as males and females. And I think we shouldn't be afraid of that.
From the Buddhist point of view, sexual misconduct itself is a wrong deed.
In Islam, it is prohibited. Morally also it is wrong. Having sexual relationship before marriage is totally prohibited. Otherwise, there will not be difference between a man and an animal.
How lucky do you feel? If you are willing to marry a woman without knowing whether you are compatible?
I don't think it's a question of should. Darwin, 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 Darwin. They're going to.
What people do in their own private life is no concern of mine and no concern of yours and no concern of anybody else's.
It's part of a developing process of discovering who we really do feel an affinity with and who we really do want to be with and who we do really want to continue the human race with.
He often talked about the propensity that we have to turn relationship into a problem. So when asked about sex, he would often say, why do you make sex a problem at all? Sex is such a simple activity of life It's a healthy activity of life.
You know, sex is a biological expression. It's not a moral issue.
Girls, you have breasts. That's not for your boyfriends to be playing with and fondling, no. You need to get a t-shirt that says, hands off, girls. Don't touch. Now, once you get married, girls, it's all right for your husband to play around. Hey, but the baby gets first dibbies.
In a culture that prohibits premarital sex, there are going to be many costs to having it. As we've seen recently in the Middle East, where people are stoned to death for adultery, for example. In the United States, the costs are fewer.
If you tell your child, well, sex is bad, well, the first time they have sex, they'll think you just don't know how to have it because they had a good time with it.
If you have sex outside of marriage, you're saying that marriage is irrelevant. Your relationship is not rooted in love, but in lust.
Sexual relations ought to be kept only in the marriage context, because otherwise the only reason for sexual relations is lust, it's pleasure. And you're getting into hedonism. That's what the homosexual agenda is really about, is sexual hedonism.
I think you can have sex before marriage if there's respect. I didn't say love, I said respect. Because what we call love, romantic love, I'll use that word again, is bull. Romantic love is lust.
I've had to tell a lot of people they're going to die after I've operated on them. And the men take this news with greater fear than women do. I think that the whole virgin thing, the whole abstinence thing, is all about once men discovered they were going to die, they understood that they could cheat death a little bit if they knew who their children were.
It's enormously costly to bring up a child. And so the female knows absolutely with 100% certainty whether a child is hers or not. The male does not know for sure. So being cuckold, that is raising somebody else's offspring, means you're investing your energy into somebody else's DNA, and this is very risky thing to do. So we have built into our systems I talked about the moral emotions. Jealousy is one of these. The fact that jealousy exists, the green monster, because we really want to enforce the fact that our offspring, the investment we're making in our offspring, are really our offspring. And that's why religion has all these rules about this, because they got it from evolution. Evolution gave us those prohibitions.
The living together and actually trying to work out how you pay your rent and your rates and what kind of friends you have and whether you have parties is much worse than whether you have good sex or not.
If a person has sex with a spouse and only a spouse, then a lot of jealousy that might happen, a lot of societal conflict is alleviated, or at least reduced.
Everybody wants security. And to be secure in your relationship would seem to indicate you'd want some kind of marital vows.
Sometimes families would marry to share resources. It was really a social construct, and it wasn't until quite some time later that the whole romantic love thing got mixed in with marriage. It was never about that throughout most of human history.
And it seems to me people who have condemned sex before marriage have often had a hard time trying to explain why marriage suddenly makes it okay. And it seems to me the sort of idea that, well, because then it's for the purpose of having children, it's just psychologically false in almost every case. I mean, people have sex without the intention of having children, and often with the intention of not having children.
I've had sex prior to marriage. I mean, and I believe that most people do have sex prior to marriage. Kind of a loaded question, because no, they shouldn't have sex prior to marriage, because the payoff is really great later if they don't.
Yes, it should be held for marriage. Why? Because there's something so significant and powerful about it that combines you with the other person and brings you into one flesh.
Once we have sexual intercourse with a person, we literally become one. We begin to take on the attributes of that person, because we're not two people anymore, we're one.
If everyone's out there doing it, I mean, no one wants to really get married and you want to play the field and stuff, but we're supposed to pray for our soulmates. And if everyone was doing what was in the book when they were growing up and going to church and praying for the right person to come in their life, and they had true love and they had the Lord, they would get married, stay married, and You know, that's the whole thing that's out there. There's so much sin in the world. People don't know who he is, and you know, the soulmate thing is out there for everyone. But you must ask. You know, it says, "Ask and it shall be given to you. Seek and you'll find it. Knock and the door will be open unto you."
Much easier to have people practice monogamous marriage if they have not been promiscuous prior to entering into that marriage.
You know, before I was saved, I was like, woo, whatever. But when Raymond and I were dating, oh, I got mocked so hard about, what do you mean you're not, you already have 3 kids, what do you mean you're not having sex before you're married? And I said, you know, it's just not what the Lord wants for us.
I didn't get married until I was 38. If I had worried about the issue of premarital sex and any guilt or anything, it would have been a long time coming for me.
फिर 25 साल तक औरत के साथ बच्चे बनाओ, 50 साल के बाद 52 वर्ष औरत और आदमी साथ रहो, भोग नहीं करना है और बुढ़ापे में संन्यास ले लो.
Maybe we should, as a nation, decide to raise our kids with the parents that they started with. And, you know, we say it was a mistake to allow easy divorce. We need to pull it back, make divorce much more rare, but not punish anybody who lived by the rules we tried. We tried it, it's hard, but let's pull back. Let's make divorce more difficult. Let's make marriage mean more, so that when you get married, it's a contract between you and society, not just between 2 people.
I didn't understand the rules of not going out and having sex until I get pregnant, and I see why the consequences will be harder than what, you know, not doing it will be. Doing drugs, the consequences of that. I didn't understand that my mom and dad aren't always going to be right, but the majority of the time, the reasons why they have the rules are for my own safety and for my own good.
That act is an act that also gives you release. It gives you comfort. But the ultimate act of that and purpose of that for God is to procreate.
Matter of fact, it's my favorite way to worship God is to have relations with my wife. I mean, to feel His hand on my back when I make love to my wife is powerful. I mean, people giggle at that, but it's powerful. If you understood the power and the enigmatic expression of lovemaking with one spouse and the way God put it, you'd feel not only shame, but just really let down for the experience of just the sexual gratification with another person. And then also to give away something so precious for nothing.
On the days when there was one tribe we were all part of, and the whole tribe would gather together and through their attention on this one particular couple, empower that couple with the force of the entire tribe. But we're not living in tribes anymore. And so a different model of marriage can be embraced.
Sex before marriage? You know what? We do not discuss sex at our house. We really don't. We really don't. The kids don't. I have a very beautiful daughter and I have a very handsome son. And during that whole period, I wish to God that my daughter would be fat and pimply. But no, she was very easy on the eyes, so I spent a lot of time grounding her and throwing rocks at teenage boys that surrounded our house and stuff like that. My son, he was fine.
Is masturbation a sin?
What do you think about that, John?
What a strange question.
I think
If we'd been living in the 19th century, of course, we would have responded very differently. But I think we're a post-Freudian society. We're so sexualized now about the way human adults come to maturity and about how children develop, and we're not so afraid about the dangers as they saw them as that. I feel it's something that is sinful in the sense that it's not healthy and not productive of good, and God, in His mercy, I would have thought, would want it not to become part of your life.
Masturbation is self-abuse. That is also a sin. It's wasting your seed.
What scripture do you have to support that?
That would be included in what the Bible calls uncleanness and lasciviousness. The primary purpose of sex is for procreation. You can't conceive through masturbation.
How does that get into this discussion?
I don't think
I don't have any reason for believing that masturbation is a sin.
Not the way I do it.
任した。
いや任せないでここで任せないで。
はい、何ですか質問は。
マスターベーションは悪いことなんでしょうか。
はい、仏教では悪いことだとされてます。仏教では僧侶にとって悪いことだとされてます。
I just think anything that exceeds the limit is an abomination in the eyesight of God. Because if I do that all day, every day, and if I'm doing that, and if I'm releasing my semen, I mean, at what point does it get to be dangerous? Because that's taking fluid out of the body, that's taking vitamins out of the body, that's taking calcium out of the body.
这个性是性这个性恋出来以后，才能与道合真呀。
Sex ain't supposed to be you, but one way, and that's reduce a child, boy or girl.
If you keep on masturbating every now and then, you are denying your body the energy that was there.
It is a sin for the masturbator because it is wasting your energy for unnecessary purpose without any purpose.
Well, according to the Baha'i faith, masturbation would not be an appropriate form of sexual expression.
Many Nigerian men believe that it falls off if they touch it with their hand, so they have to get a woman to do it. They cannot manually masturbate. The culture prevents them from doing so. So is the sin? Yes, for them it absolutely is.
When a guy masturbates, when a woman does, though it's not as prevalent a problem, a guy is able to gratify himself with fantasies of women that don't exist in the real world. And no woman he ever meets is going to behave as the women in his fantasies do. The result is that he's going to be endlessly disappointed.
I don't think it's satisfying. I don't know if it's I don't know. If the sin gets in it, I don't think it's such a great thing when there's so many other things to do.
If masturbation were a sin, I don't know what I would do for 8 hours a day.
I do not believe that masturbation is a sin in any shape, form or size. No, and I wouldn't think of a single pagan or druid who would believe that either.
If it is, I'm in trouble.
If you don't masturbate, you're denying yourself a great deal of pleasure. I know that.
I don't think anything is a sin as long as it is an honoring of who you are, and everything that we have on our body is ours. And anything that provides pleasure, that is you allowing yourself to experience yourself from this place of just love and joy, how can that be a sin?
How could, first of all, the creator of the universe, with its billions of galaxies, that creator is worried about us touching ourselves?
It's a natural thing. I'm assuming it's from beginning of time.
At least being a psychologist, I know that it's a very natural human instinct.
Sin is not a useful concept. Right and wrong, I find useful. I don't find masturbation wrong.
Is it wrong to masturbate? And I always say, depends on what you're thinking about when you do it. And generally the answers aren't too good.
I won't say every single act of masturbation is gravely sinful, but it's a habit that diminishes a person's freedom and enslaves them to some extent. And most kids do masturbate from time to time, but they overcome it when they become adults.
There are two views divided. Majority scholars say that it's a sin. Some scholars say that if it's for a benefit, if it's not letting you do any, if it's to prevent from you doing any sexual intercourse or adultery, if it's for that purpose, then it's allowed.
Most animals do not masturbate. So you have to ask, why do human, especially the human male, expend so much energy masturbating, which from a evolutionary point of view makes no sense, because if you're masturbating, a big saber-toothed tiger can sneak up behind you and eat you. You know, I mean, you have to wander away from everybody else to do it, you know. It wouldn't make sense. But by creating this sexual tension in the human male that is so extraordinary, you create a willingness on his part to do just about anything to get the acquiescence of a female.
Young men are in misery and they masturbate, and it has nothing to do with their health or anything. The only thing that's a sin is what the religious people do to them, to young people, by saying it's a sin to masturbate. And suddenly they feel guilty and creates an unhealthy environment, an interior environment. And that is the sin.
If my bishop or pope were listening to my answer to this, I don't believe it is. It was once upon a time, I don't believe it is. We now know from medical scientific evidence that it is a natural release of pent-up tensions, and be they sexual or otherwise, within persons, especially younger persons, and it's a natural release of that.
Many people are well advised to turn to it instead of promiscuous sex.
And so the best thing to do is allow your body to unfold as it is and greet and have union with everything that comes along with it. Ultimately, the perfection of that is celibacy, because you're already in your motion, free here, in union with all beings. But in the meantime, in the in-between time, get it on with any orifice.
These are great surprise questions, Roger. You know what? Anything that gets you through the night's all right, you know? Like the Beatles have said, you know?
Are you a saint? Maybe a saint could have just sit there and done nothing. But since very few of us are saints, I think it is more pragmatic to look at choices of the one that caused least harm.
I remember listening to people saying, hey, everybody masturbates. Come on, man, you do too. And then I said, honest to God, I have no idea what you're talking about. Please, no need to show me.
Is masturbation a sin?
No. In public places.
What determines a person's sexuality?
Go back to your first time that you had some inkling of some sort of sexual impulse. Did you suddenly have a multiple choice question come up? I'm going to choose men, women, farm animals.
To say that they was born that way would be saying that God didn't know what he was doing.
Human beings are created male and female. Their anatomies are complementary. Their sexual organs are complementary. Therefore, it would seem to be the natural order relationship would seem to be male and female.
So homosexuality is not genetic at all. A person can't be born with homosexuality, impossible. A person cannot be born with sin.
I think homosexuality is like being a vegetarian or like being a vegan, that's a choice you make.
People choose to use their gift of sexuality in perverted manners.
Science says that they're born that way, and Christians believe that they become that way.
I have found no scripture nowhere on this planet that say man should lay down and have sex with a man, or a woman should lay down and have sex with a woman. I do not hate persons who may be involved in this act. I do not appreciate the act, but the person, I believe, can be rescued.
If it's not a choice and you were born that way, it's a choice now. You have to choose now.
しかし最終的に決めてるのは本人が自覚してようがしてまいが自分が決めているはずです。
There are genetic factors that make a person predisposed to certain attractions or lack of attractions, but I don't think people are born homosexual.
I think people grow out to be gay.
It's genetics and early biochemistry in the womb and just a tiny bit of environment.
The environment you're in could determine whether you actually discover it or not. Some people don't discover it till they're older, 30, 40, 50 years old. But I think it's always there.
I knew from before I was 5 years old that I was different.
We are born because of our own karma. Because of our karma, we become men or women and heterosex. That is our due to karma this has happened, not our choice.
Even if I were to be celibate, I'm still gay. Being gay is not what you do with your body. being gay is a matter of the heart. It's who you fall in love with. It's who you attach to. And I can't explain why where an attachment comes from. People talk about whether it's a choice or anything. At some point, whatever flavor of ice cream is your favorite flavor of ice cream. Let's say it's chocolate. Did at some point you decide chocolate was your favorite, or it just is? If you're straight, to say that it's a choice assumes that at some point in your life you actually had a choice. So you mean every straight person was equally attracted to a man versus a woman and made a choice? No, I'm not going to be attracted to men, I'm going to be attracted to women. That didn't happen. So if straight people aren't faced with that choice, why would you assume that a gay person would be faced with a similar choice? So when it comes to separating behaviors from orientation, I don't believe that God, who created human beings in God's own image, would create gay people and then insist that they not live out their lives.
Some people are born with a particular orientation, other people are born with confused orientations and have to work this out as life progresses.
And then you have circumstances that can influence you. So let's say if a woman is abused or has had really bad experiences with men, it might influence her one way or another to not find happiness and joy in a relationship with a man.
I know one thing, it ain't the plumbing.
What people usually say is if it's a choice, in any sense of the word, then therefore you can be morally condemned. But as long as you're conducting yourself with compassion and honesty, I don't care who you have sex with.
I love to speak not of sexuality, but of love energies. Sexuality is love energy.
The soul is both, in a sense, male and female, and so sometimes can choose to be born into a male or female body, but express either the energy that is typically assigned to it or the energy that is not.
We all have the male and female because we are our mother and our father within one body. So all of us, whether you're Christian or not, we're all from that male and female. And sometimes the female side in a male just shows itself, and you're born that way. You're given that gift.
It seems to be a combination of natural disposition and environmental influences of various kinds. And to some extent, it may be voluntarily chosen. To some extent, it is not voluntarily chosen. So I suppose it differs from case to case.
There are certain people who likely, once again, have a biological vulnerability toward homosexuality. I'm concerned, though, that in the common public square controversy that's going on about this, that people tend to become polarized. They tend to see this, well, it's either biologically predestined or something that a person has complete cognitive control over. I think what we're going to find out is that it's neither of those. I think when we say that people have a biological vulnerability toward it, I think what we mean by that is that certain people to a greater or lesser extent have just that, a vulnerability toward it. Now whether that presents itself in full-fledged homosexuality or not, I think depends a lot on the person.
Well, a person's sexuality is determined by how we are created. So it's not that we don't learn things as we grow and we aren't influenced or have that our culture and our society and our families and friends and church don't impact us and mold some of that. But certainly the very basic of who we are is how we are created.
Most of what I read suggests that sexual orientation is in fact partially a function of brain structure.
There does seem to be some overlap that homosexual individuals tend to be respond to certain stimuli, and I don't necessarily mean sexual stimuli, but visual stimuli, similarly to people of the opposite sex.
There is some evidence from twin studies that if one identical twin is homosexual, the likelihood is that his brother will be too, and that is independent of whether they're reared together or separately.
There have been studies in that there are homosexual relationships among apes.
and especially for men, you were born gay or you were born straight. This is a little less true for women who seem to have more sexual plasticity, that is, the ability to change sexual orientation in midstream.
There is a continuum, and even in one's life, you could tweak it like a dial on that continuum if you want to explore different storylines.
It's a spectrum too. There's some people who are, very strongly homosexual, heterosexual, and some in between.
We're born with certain predispositions, and then our society and culture creates this brain that we have.
The thing I don't understand is why this question arouses such fury, because having a wholehearted altruism towards the poor or being a vicious murderer also have aspects which are environmental and aspects which are genetic, and we approve of one and disapprove of the other because of the behavior, not because whether it's genetic or environmental, or one's 38% genetic and the other's 22% genetic.
Bottom line, it's a result of lust.
Well, the basic thing is that people have different preferences and you should respect them.
I think our makeup is predetermined because nobody told me as a little boy to look up my teacher's skirt when I was 4 years old. But I was fascinated by it. She walked by and then a little girl said, "Stevie looked up your skirt." It was embarrassing. I was in nursery school. But nobody told me to do that. Clearly.
Why did you do it?
I wanted to know what was up there. And I was shocked.
Should homosexuals be put to death, as it says in the Old Testament?
None of the ones that I know. Well, one guy, maybe, and he's just, I don't care for him. It's not because he's gay or homosexual. It's just because he's too loud.
Oh, no. You'd probably lose most of the hierarchy of these religions.
Homosexuality is really regarded in the Bible as an abomination, which is something that it's basically so bad that God actually turns his back to it.
To je đavolo rukovodi s nima. Nije od Boga to.
पाप है दिन में 12 टाइम्स हमको उत्तेजना होती है हम भोग करें 12 टाइम्स 12 टाइम्स उसको कंट्रोल करना है.
It's like an abuse of one man on the other.
According to this, is a sickness.
God created woman for your enjoyment and a good partner for your life, and she can please you better than a man. Why you want to go to the nonsense? I'm sorry.
One of the purpose he created us was to multiply. He said, be fruitful and multiply, and gay people can't do that.
The ultra-Orthodox communities, they write up on the wall these big posters, and they will mention all kinds of sins that non-Orthodox Jews do, and they will only call this they'll call it the abomination, and won't even call it by anything else. It's the abomination.
Should homosexuals be put to death, as it demands in the Bible?
And indeed it does demand that. It's an abomination before the Lord. So is a woman wearing pants, incidentally. Cross-dressing is immoral. It's an abomination. It says it's an abomination before the Lord.
We call them clobber passages. There are a lot of clobber passages in the Bible that have been used to beat up gay and lesbian people. I think most people fail to take whatever is written in the context that it's written. Most people who use those passages have no idea what the Bible really says.
God destroyed the ancient twin cities of Sodom and Gomorrah for this very sin.
All of those was homosexuals that came to Lot's house and wanted to be with those angels, that which they didn't know it. And before they could get out of it, they had to blind all of those people because of their sexual perverseness.
Well, when these strangers came out of the desert and the city of Sodom not only refused to be hospitable, but were threatening violence to them and even rape of the men that were there. That was the sin of Sodom, not homosexuality. It's how you treat the strangers or the people that are different among you.
Everybody is different. Just live with each other, that's all. One day, one time, you're going to need their help. You're going to need their help one time.
So homosexuality in itself is a condition, it cannot be sinful, surely, since the vast majority of homosexual people, I think, are not responsible for their condition, but for the way in which they exercise their sexuality, of course, is a choice again, and the same applies to heterosexuality in relation to respect for self and respect for others, the dignity of others as human beings, not objects that we pick up or let down at will to gratify ourselves. whether it is within the context of heterosexuality or homosexuality.
The Bible says that we were created, every one of us, in the image of God. Therefore, then the next question I have to ask then, is God homosexual? I have lived a lot of years. I have found no one on either side of the table that's willing and ready to say God is a homosexual.
If God didn't like gays, wouldn't he stop making them? You know, after the first few? Or even after the first two, really? He'd be like, oh, I'm not going to do that again.
The people who believe that homosexuality is in any sense unnatural, first, don't know any science, but secondly, it seems to me that they're on the losing side of history.
Basically, the church point of view has been rather strict, although I think, you know, the more enlightened view that's developing, if you think of it as a given orientation, then unless a person has a call for celibacy, you know, some kind of sexual expression is to be expected in intimacy, whether it's homosexual or heterosexual.
Okay, it's hard for me. I have homosexual friends. It's hard for me to accept that they should die because of that.
Official position of Judaism is that homosexuality is forbidden. Homosexuality between males is forbidden from the Torah. Homosexuality between females is something that's only rabbinically forbidden, and therefore we're a little more lenient on it.
There is a community currently in Jerusalem called the Orthodikes.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
one
Orthodox lesbians.
I think one of the biggest problems, especially with homosexuality, is there is no prohibition against being gay or a lesbian. The prohibition are certain acts of homosexuality. Unfortunately, people cannot separate sexual intercourse with sexuality.
You're setting yourselves up for the destruction that God promises you in His holy word. Many people stereotype me as a homophobe. I'm not a homophobe. What is homophobia? It's an irrational fear of homosexuals. Exactly. I have very rational reasons why, not that I fear homosexuals, but why I'm against the sin of homosexuality. And I am not against homosexuals. Don't misunderstand. Homosexuals can be redeemed. They can be saved by God. They need to just stop the homosexual sex that they have. A man needs to love another man without involving sexual relations. Just stop the sex. I support gay marriage. I think homosexuals ought to find a lesbian, and the homo and the lesbian get married.
We even have ministers that will marry two men. Now, this marriage is no good in the sight of God, but the state legalized it. And when the state legalized it, well, then they get all of the advantages of a normal married couple, which is, when I say normal married couple, it is a man and a woman.
According to Indian mythology, every human being is made up of both the Shiva and Shakti, mother and the father element, aspect in him. So when the female aspect dominates or the male aspect dominates, their preferences also go that way.
Sexuality is a very complicated thing, and I'm convinced that most people never give it a second thought because they don't have to. We people who are gay are forced to face it and try and figure it out. And my own personal experience, I'm convinced that we are born this way.
I know a number of gay people. I don't know anyone who's woke up one day and thought, oh, how marvelous, I'm gay. It seems to me that most people wrestle with the issue of being gay.
I really have to believe, because I believe in a loving God, that He doesn't set us up for failure. But I do know that the reality of living is that many of us have a sense in which in our lives we have greater hardship than other people do.
If we are born a certain way, should we be second-class citizens as a result? Well, it seems clear to me that the answer is no. But that goes far beyond being born gay. It also is being born female or being born black, or there's all sorts of ways we can be born and we will be deprived of certain kinds of rights and opportunities as a result. Being gay is just one of them.
Every individual has to pass through homosexual experiences at some point. Also in reincarnation, we have to pass through all these. We have to pass through all perversions and sins and all of those things. Bob has explained that every real saint knows that at one time they were also the ultimate sinner. What Bob had stressed, the real harm lies in promiscuity, not sexual orientation.
Adultery is a sin, and there are other sins that exist in there. And so as the Christian church stands up and wants to berate the homosexual population and throw homosexuals out of the church, if we threw out every fornicator in the church, we'd be empty. So I think we deal with sexual issues openly, and we deal with them all equally. If I came to you and said, hey, your son's a homosexual and this has happened in our church, you'd just be tore up. But if I came to you and said, hey, your son's sleeping with the cheerleaders at high school, you'd probably smile and go, all right. They're equal, and they're equally sin.
They're doing as they like. Everyone's doing as they like. That person has to decide for themselves whether it's harmful or not.
Something that God doesn't want. Can someone have a propensity for that? Evidently. Does that mean that I think he should overcome it? Yes.
To tell them that they can adopt children, when you know that they are homosexuals, what tendencies will this child grow up in? They say, well, we have a loving home, but what tendencies do they grow up with? They grow up thinking that this homosexual relationship is normal, and it is not. It is just as abnormal can get in every sense of the word.
Wherever it came from within me, not from outside of me. And I was not culturally exposed to homosexuality. I lived in a very small town in Central California. Never had heard the word gay, didn't know what it meant.
Well, it's very difficult a lot of the times if you have religious family members for them to accept the fact that you no longer believe what they do. I remember my mom took me coming out to her as gay much better than she took me coming out to her as an atheist. Being gay, she could see that was something that was not a choice, and there were kind of signs and signals that she had all throughout when I was growing up. But being an atheist is a choice, and I think it's also very disturbing to have your own child kind of reject everything that you've taught them to be true.
What is morality?
Morality is to believe in one word, but for us, word of God, and to live as God words.
ईश्वर के प्रति जो भाव है वही नैतिकता है। सत्य पे ही चलना यही नैतिकता है। ईश्वर को भजे, इसी को परिभाषित करने के लिए हम इस पृथ्वी पर आए हैं।
I define morality as what everyone or very nearly everyone ought to do.
这个德是后天不断的修，不断的这个积德行善。
西方孩子成年了以后，他可能就脱离了家庭，他和家庭关系就非常少。而中国呢，第二代、第三代都有。说是就是一个这个德应该分两类，一个社会公德，还有一个家庭伦理。
Morality means discipline. Discipline means to make yourself moral.
God's law is based upon what promotes the highest well-being of everyone in the universe.
Morals in our life are things to guard us against self-destruction, is basically what they are. They don't give life, but they do preserve life.
What supports life and what does not?
The behavior, the thoughts and values that you cherish throughout your life, which does not hurt others.
Morality should be a set of rules by which we regard the humanity of another as being of equal value as our own humanity.
Feel the sorrow and the problems of others and help to them.
人が見てるから助けるではなくて、見えないところでの。
So morality is necessary to start to become a spiritual person. That is the foundation.
Morality is humanity. And then what is moral is human. What is immoral is not human.
Just to have understanding to each other and to maintain our human respect. And it is not only a dream, but it is necessity for all of us to follow what I say, the sense of universal responsibility.
No, I don't, when I preach, talk in terms of morality or ethics that much. I talk about sin and righteousness, holiness.
God doesn't use those terms, and so the term itself is misleading. God will talk about truth and falsehood and right and wrong. Morality? So morality generally is absolutely what people decide. Okay, so I don't necessarily have to buy into that system.
To have a desire to do what is right and following what is right. And your next question is, what is right?
What is right?
It's the opposite of wrong.
Morality is when you're doing something and there's a check in your heart that maybe this shouldn't be happening.
And you can live in a dream world or think you're doing something, but when the rubber meets the road, you are who you are, and you know what you are is what you say to someone and how you keep your word in that. And to me, it's totally, it's all one. I mean, I built a $6 million shopping center on a handshake, and people told me I was nuts, right? And it's not. If you know the person and you know you're dealing with an ethical, honest person, it's a neat thing. And I hope when I leave this world that people think, Jim was a pretty honest guy, ethical guy, he treated me right.
The part of the brain, the pleasure center of the brain that lights up when you take cocaine and when you have sex and so on, also lights up when you do nice things for people. We have brain scan studies of people's brains lighting up when they cooperate and help somebody in a little computer game. They're being rewarded for being nice. But why should that be there? Because it has to be there for us to survive. We evolved a moral sense. That is the idea of being cooperative, altruistic, pro-social, nice. We also have a dark side, but in order to live in a social primate group, you have to be cooperative, pro-social, altruistic, and so forth, in order for us as individuals to live and for the group to survive. Out of that comes this system built into our brains that rewards us for being nice.
Ancient humans. I'm living in a cave. And I see my brother Og's woman, to the extent that they could hook up in those days. And maybe I want to grab his woman. And he doesn't like that. He has some territorial response. So he hits me over the head with a club. The next day, Og wants to go out and get himself a woolly mammoth, except that I'm wounded in the cave, or he killed me outright, and now he doesn't eat because he doesn't have my cooperation. I see early morality being pragmatic, as sort of a codification of pragmatic ways of us to get along, to survive better, collectively.
Group cohesion must have been very important for the survival of human groups over long periods of time. And things that threaten group well-being are more or less universally frowned upon.
Morality provides people with the rules of the game, with how one should behave.
Our ability to cooperate is our greatest evolutionary adaptation, much better than the opposable thumb or the standing upright, even the language.
Morality is determined by the types of behaviors that are given attention versus the types of behaviors that are shunned by the greater community, and which one is just dropped into at birth. You didn't choose to take up any of these rules which you were given. You just had to act, or else you were sent to bed without supper.
I think pain and pleasure, that dichotomy, and good and bad are intimately related. What we call bad is almost always something that brings us, or more likely, other people pain. And what we call good is something that almost always brings us or other people pleasure. There are very few things that bring pleasure to great numbers of the population that we call bad, and vice versa with good. Little children have a concept of pleasure and pain. In fact, all organisms do. they build their sense of morality on their concepts of what feels good and what feels bad. Good things are those which bring pleasure. Bad things are those which bring pain to me. But what we learn very quickly as we develop is sometimes the things that make me feel good make other people feel bad. Like when I take Tommy's ice cream. I like it, but he doesn't. Well, now Tommy gets pretty mad at me and he might even hit me. His social disapproval can feel bad and Mom yells at me. Now suddenly there's these things that might have made me feel good, but because they make others feel bad, I'm going to start labeling them as immoral. That's how a sense of morality gets built, on what kinds of things give us pleasure and give us pain.
Morality is the behavior that all members of a tight-knit community must exhibit towards each other in order to live in harmony.
Human beings, like animals, like affection and love and consideration, and these generate these prescriptive moral principles or ethical principles, and one learns that, you know, in our governmental system to try to ensure the best kind of morality.
Chimpanzees are moral animals.
They'll exhibit altruistic behavior.
Yeah, they know what's right and wrong. They know who's cheating them. And when somebody does something nice for them, they reward them or they groom them. So we know that this is a behavior pattern that's part of any social animal that's a higher animal.
No matter what your religion is, it's going to include a morality. That this is the way the world works, therefore we should. And there is no person without a morality. And a morality that they expect other people to follow.
Krishnamurti was fairly disparaging of the traditional views of morality and ethics because he said they were all based simply on man-made constructs that were made for the convenience of cultures and governments and religions. And that to be truly moral, to be truly ethical, one must have a religious mind. One must have a perception, a direct perception of reality.
Religion is often said to make people more moral, in which case I would like to ask why there are very few atheists in prison. I believe that the reason there are very many fewer atheists in prison is straightforward. I mean, atheism is strongly connected to intelligence, and getting caught is strongly anti-correlated to intelligence.
I think morality does have a definition that's outside religion, and I think many atheists like myself are irritated when religious people suggest that without religion there can be no morality. I think all of us has a moral code. We have notions of what's right and what's wrong. It doesn't require any belief in the supernatural.
Morality should be a personal concern to do justice to others. Otherwise, religiosity doesn't help much.
Einstein argued that morality and religion are really two different things. That morality is much too important to leave to religion. He also pointed out that morality is much more homogeneous than religion is. That there's much more agreement on what's right and what's wrong than there is about the statements that many religions make.
Life is the whole 4 billion year process of evolution on this planet. That's what's sacred. That is the sacred aspect of life. In order to preserve that, what do we need to do? Do we just need to reproduce like rabbits? Is that going to? No, because then we overrun the planet. We use far too many resources. We destroy it for our children, and then there will be a crash in the future. We have to really get honest that some of the things we're doing today are immoral when you look at them from a cosmic point of view. Well, they may be moral from your religious point of view.
Social changes can also lead to changes in the way people should behave.
Let's talk about ethics. What makes something wrong and what makes something right? What makes one behavior righteous and holy?
Ethics is only based on not hurting any other individual. If you go through your life without hurting any other individual and you don't believe in God, I don't feel like that you've lived a bad life.
If you follow the commandments like you never kill, you never steal, you never covet, you live a moral life and you never harm anyone, are you a good person if you don't believe in God?
No, you're not a good person.
The word ethics is a kind of very, I don't like the word because what a society considers ethical is very loosely defined.
I mean, Israel remembers the Holocaust very well, and it was perfectly fine in Germany then to say he's a Jew and send him off to the camps to be killed. And that was considered ethical behavior.
Frederick Douglass says in his 4th of July speech, he said, "There is no man under the mantle of heaven that does not understand that slavery is wrong for him."
It's wrong to keep slaves. It's wrong to treat women as inferior and things like that. You won't find in most holy books. And so they come from a moral consensus, a civilized, a shifting, I've called it the shifting moral zeitgeist, which is a consensus that arises from the zeitgeist of the time, the newspapers, the conversations, the books, the parliamentary debates, the judicial decisions of the time, based on those of the past, such that nowadays we regard slavery as unthinkable, whereas in not that long ago it was simply the norm and was in biblical times.
We take morality to be something very specific. Morals, back, say, in the days of Aristotle, or even as late as the 17th, 18th century, really just referred to practical matters. So there wasn't a very clear distinction between moral values and non-moral values. So Aristotle would talk about something being a virtue or an excellence, and he would count being friendly right along with being trustworthy. Now we would say those are two very different kinds of things. And I think what's happened is that the word morality has become very loaded, so that moral values are those that trump other values. And then the question is, okay, no, what's important there? Well, I think one of the grossest illustrations of the abuse of that conception is the fact that if you look at what morality comes to mean in the 19th century and 20th century America, it more often than not has to do with sex. So a person's moral values in the last election, for example, had much more to do with whether they accepted the idea of gay marriage, or they accepted the idea of not just abortion, but sex before marriage, than it did with questions like, is it wrong to tell a lie to start a war?
Could you know inherently right and wrong, or is it something that has to be taught socially?
If we knew the purpose of life, then we could judge right or wrong against this absolute. If there was an absolute statement of, you're here in order to take care of the earth and have children and populate the universe and make it self-aware, then as long as we were moving along that path, we'd know we were going the right direction. Perhaps right, operationally, is doing the things that make life best for the largest number of people. And when you do that, I think you have a sense that you've done the right thing.
Is there a moral yardstick that applies to all cultures?
You know, cultures that emphasize compassion and love for people within the community and those who are not part of the community, in terms of my own personal views, is of greater value than a culture that is always at war and that sees its enemies as evil, or that thinks that somehow their religious values have to be imposed on the rest of the world.
Now, I believe there is a moral yardstick, and that is found in God's love. Treating others as you want to be treated.
Morality is completely subjective to the society that you're in. What's moral here and now may not be moral in 10 years, and most probably was not moral 50 years ago.
Privacy, for instance, may turn out to have been a passing fad. It's only a few hundred years old. The medieval kings didn't expect privacy. They were surrounded by guards at all times. Medieval peasants didn't expect privacy. The king could enter at any time. It may be going. The devices of homeland security are growing ever more sophisticated, and they're pretty damn good now.
Morality always has to be put in some sort of context, because again, think about those people that flew those planes into the Twin Towers. They were very moral. I mean, there was a real moral context for what they did. In their eyes, they were sacrificing themselves and others for a greater good. Morality is a really problematic thing because if it's not put into some sort of context, it can do so much harm.
It definitely changes in different cultures. That's why it's such a slippery slope. That's why I won't define morality based on societal mores. I'll define morality based on absolute imposition of the Torah. God will define what's moral. So God will say slavery is moral, but adultery isn't. Now, you see, he doesn't use those words moral, and that's why the whole term is somewhat misleading.
Yeah, different cultures do have different morals. But we share a lot of same morals, but the truth is, let's take the American Christian community. We have jumped on the whole thing of grace in Christ Jesus, which Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a great German theologian, said, let's call it cheap grace, because people just decide, well, Jesus loves me no matter, so I'll do what I want.
I would say to you that there is a yardstick that should be used, but is it used? No, because there are certain cultures that do not base their existence on God's Word.
Maybe people would have more morals if they were whacked with their own moral yardstick.
The Muslim faith possibly looks over at us and says, well, there are people with no morals. Well, we do have the same morals. We believe in that same purity. We're just not, we don't have the same fear that you do. And that's where fear really comes back. Maybe we should have a fear of the consequences in the least. But if you go over to Hindu faith, there's a lot of things that we would consider extremely amoral when it comes to the way that the caste system is set up and things of that nature.
In your country, for example, drinks is a common factor. It is not known as a bad. But in our society, it is not looked in a very good way.
There's Inuit tribes that practice infanticide, as it were. They allow certain infants to die, that their population can only handle so many, and they allow this to happen. Well, surely we would all agree that killing babies is immoral in all circumstances for everyone at all times. No, clearly not. You can't say that. Just most of the time, for most people, you know.
Culture matters. That is one thing I've been turning over in my head recently too. Culture really matters. Like, I used to be this kind of postmodernist culture is good, all culture is good kind of person. And now I think, no, some culture is bad. Some culture is bad and other cultures are good. I think if your culture takes young 12-year-old virgins to a mountaintop and kills them, I would say that's bad. I think if your culture kills whales, even though that might have made sense hundreds of years ago, but now it doesn't make sense, I don't think you should be allowed to continue to do that.
I would say, for example, that female circumcision in some African countries is wrong. And it doesn't matter what the local practices are. It doesn't matter that this is part of a woman's self-identity. It's wrong. But then, of course, the question immediately comes up, well, what about male circumcision in this country? Why is that better?
So obviously God does not want everyone to be circumcised. If everyone were circumcised, it would not be a sign unique to the Jews. The kosher laws, the dietary laws, were once again given primarily to maintain the Jewish culture. So they would not intermarry and so on and lose their identity.
That's not true.
So I'm not to keep the dietary laws. I'm to keep the moral law. That's universal. I don't offer up, animal sacrifices. So there are things. There's the moral law, which is universal, given to all men, Jews and Gentiles, and then there's the ceremonial law, given uniquely to the Jews.
A lot of the indigenous cultures in the world have pretty much the same teachings, the same morals.
Look at the American Indian in the Northwest. When they felt that they were wealthy enough, they had a party and they gave everything they owned away. That was the moral thing to do, and started over. Now the entire community showed tremendous respect to that family. Now, if you did it today, gave everything away and said, I'm starting over because this is the moral thing to do, you'd be in a nut house.
Well, I think treat others as you'd have them treat you would be a good one, except some people like being beaten within an inch of their life with a cat o' nine tails. So does that mean because they like being beat with it, that they should beat you with it?
There's no moral yardstick that applies to all people. Go and talk to a cannibal. They'll tell you how great that last missionary was. And yeah, and of course you have to eat human flesh. Otherwise it's just wasted. Look what you do, you put it in the ground. That's immoral.
I mean, there's probably some practices that no matter what culture it is, except that one, you would have to be against. You know, like if you saw cannibals, you know, you would have to like point out to them that, you know, the final contradiction of that would be to eat yourself, you know. I mean, but most practices in the world, I think, can be adjudicated by discussion.
No, morality should be same for every culture, because the same principle every god has taught you, that don't do any sinful activity.
Cultures worldwide have prohibitions against incest. That might be one example where here's a behavior that is just wrong.
I am a moral person.
By what standard?
By my own standards that I have developed over my 26 years here on
Okay,
Earth.
well then the child molester can say, I'm a moral person by my standards. I believe the child molester thinks it's all right to have sex. The thief says, I'm a moral person by my standards. I don't steal from my friends, I just steal from strangers.
We need to agree on some type of standards.
A universal moral code would be that set of principles that allows, one, for your continued existence, and for the collective fulfillment and happiness of your people.
The biggest moral yardstick for a culture is how much freedom do they give their people, and reasonable freedom without causing harm to others.
Respect for each other, honoring others' rights, you know, giving equal rights to all. These are the basic morality.
Communities that have rule sets that enhance the ability of their members to be happy and to have families and to have their children live to adulthood in order to have children themselves, communities that do that will survive far longer than communities that have rules that don't help very much.
Killing, stealing, coveting, lying, false witness, all of that stuff, these aren't new ideas. As long as human beings have been around in large enough groups that had to sort of sustain some kind of collective existence, these same sort of moral codes arose.
Mark Hauser of Harvard University did some fascinating experiments on giving people moral dilemmas and asking them how they would respond. And there's astonishing uniformity to these rather tricky moral dilemmas. And he interprets it, and he also did similar things for tribesmen in the Amazon jungle. So there's some evidence that there are some universals in our moral responses, and they, according to Hauser, derive from our evolutionary past.
It may be that morality is based on what's good for the species.
Before civilization, we lived in small groups, small bands of hunter-gatherers, tens to a few hundreds of people. And when you have that few people, most of whom are either related to one another genetically or they know each other very well, you don't need a lot of rules. It's all done informally through behavior control mechanisms of shunning somebody that's nasty, and gossip. People talk about who's good and who's not, and who could be trusted and who can't, and that kind of thing. And it's all taken care of kind of just informally. What happened about 5,000-6,000 years ago was that bands and tribes began to coalesce into chiefdoms and states of thousands and tens of thousands of individuals. When that happened, those informal means of behavior control, the moral sense there, breaks down. It's too easy for people to get away, to cheat, and not have the consequences from the people they know and are related to. So, two institutes evolved to handle that: government and religion. Religion said, here are the rules, and we're going to write them down. And we're going to go over them every Sunday to remind you this is what you better do. And if you don't do it, there will be consequences to pay in the next life. Well, for some people, that's not enough. They don't care about the next life. They don't believe in the next life or whatever. So government said, yeah, and furthermore, here's our set of rules, and if you don't obey them, we'll do something about it now.
He says, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For The husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. And us guys love to stop there. That's the good part for us. But there's such a power in submission.
The church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be subject to their own husbands in everything.
Well, should women be treated differently than men? Yes, to a degree. You know, the Bible does say women are the weaker vessel, so men should want to protect women.
The man was created to be the leader and to provide for his family and lead the household, and the wife was created to be a help to her husband.
In the same way, husbands, you ought to love your wives as you love your own body. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and cares for it just as Christ does the church. Now, when I'm a heel, she doesn't seem to submit so good to me. She starts telling me what to do, and I generally end up submitting to her because I need to submit to someone because I'm a heel.
When I'm teaching that, wives are like, why in the world should I be submissive to this man? I said, well, you be submissive to this man just as you're submissive unto Christ. And finally, when they pick up on that, then they have to go to the husband and say, now your responsibility is to love your wife as Christ loved the church.
The scripture says, he who finds a wife finds a treasure and obtains favor from the Lord. So realizing that, I think, makes life special.
Most men are pigs. Girls, they're not interested in a smart girl. So many men feel threatened by smart girls.
Every woman should have the finest of education because these are the women that pass on the ideas to our children. So being a natural consoler, man is supposed to be able to find quiet of mind in a woman, peace in a woman. After a hard day of work, women is just natural at making you feel relaxed and bringing you into comfort, particularly when you are providing for her spiritually, morally, mentally, and emotionally. When we're hitting all of those cylinders, my God, brother, it ain't nothing that a woman won't do for a man or a man won't do for a woman if we know what God's purpose for us is. But if we start guessing it and doing what I want to do, then you get out of disharmony.
Now, I'm going to open a can of worms here, but when you look at women preachers or women ministers, that's not her role. Biblically, that's not her role.
Žene su opasne nego muškarci. Jer nabiješ 3 žene na 1000 ljudi, odmah oni se čuju galamu, a komandant puka sa 1000 ljudi komanduje i ne čuje se ništa.
在过去古代的时候，儒教里面就是那个有重男轻女，但是道教不一样，道教是从《太平经》里面就开始就主张男女平等。首先我们修炼成仙，就不单独男的能成仙，女的也能成仙。
मनुष्य और औरत कुछ नहीं है, एक ही हैं दोनों। मनुष्य और औरत में कोई फर्क नहीं है, दोनों की आत्मा एक है। कोई हमारा धर्म कर्म जाति वाति कुछ नहीं है, सब ईश्वर है।
We are treated as a soul. We are only treated as a soul, not the men and women.
Each lifetime, an individual alternates between male and female forms. That happens as a natural response to the attraction of opposites, compels the soul to seek the opposite experience of what they had just experienced.
We have druidesses, we have archdruidesses. We believe that women are capable of incredible attainments if they wish to do so.
Krishnamurti didn't give it a lot of thought because he thought it was a particular joke that American culture was so preoccupied with women's rights and equality of sexes and so on. He said, men and women are human beings. There is no difference between a man and a woman.
To say that we are all the same in a blanket way actually denies the God-given subtleties of the way God has devised each of us as male and female.
I think in terms of the church, I mean, it's interesting with this statue of the Virgin Mary. A lot of people don't like her, and one of the reasons they don't like her is because A, she doesn't come over as the passive little woman, which is how Mary is often portrayed, and B, she's far too sexy, and people are quite frightened of that. And I actually, although there are some things about her I'm not so keen on, I actually quite like this idea of a woman who is a strong representation of Mary, who clearly must have been a strong woman, and who's sort of saying, it's going to cost me, but I'm going to go for it. And I think actually we very easily think in our generation that in terms of women in the church, that the idea of women in leadership in the church is a very modern phenomenon. I think that it's evident from the scriptures that there were women in leadership. This cathedral was founded by a woman, Etheldreda, in the year 673, and she founded not a community of women, she founded a community of women and men which she was the head of.
Any civilization that pretends there is no difference between men and women is actually becoming less civilized and becoming more male. You want to know how to oppress women in this country, it's to say there is no difference between men and women. Because whenever we make differences, they are generally in the direction of enhancing the ability of women to procreate. Now, there are civilizations, Islamic civilization, where the oppression of women is real, and I'm not denying that. And there are rules that needed to be changed. It was ridiculous for women not to have the vote, to not have the ability to enter into various professions. But what it's good for us to remember is that the system that we changed did not evolve in order to oppress women. In fact, you know, the idea of women staying at home while men went out to work, that came as a blessed relief to women, so they could stay home and raise the kids.
I feel like a woman should have a longer break after having a baby so that she can have time to be with her baby, bond with her baby, nurse her baby.
There's going to come a time when we're going to have a rude awakening about this role playing in our country. And I say in our country, around the world, we're going to have a rude awakening about that. But each of us have our role. And I think anytime you see a person in the form, in the capacity of a role that they are not biblically designed for, what you are witnessing is the neglect of the person that is supposed to fulfill that role or be in that role has neglected it.
Everybody's the same. Everybody's the same. They have different values. They're bad drivers, but...
I don't see any reason that women should be treated differently than men. We're different biologically, different, have different, brain structures maybe, thought processes, but as a whole, I think that women and men should be on the same playing field.
Which one's superior?
Well, women, of course.
I wouldn't want to be treated the way men are treated. But I don't think women, in some cultures, in some society, get the best deal. And God loves both men and women, all of his children. I don't know, it just doesn't seem to be fair sometimes.
We believe in the Baha'i faith that there's an analogy that men and women are two wings of one bird. If one wing is underdeveloped, then the bird won't be able to fly correctly.
It's usually said men and women are two wheels of a same cart. Okay? Now you can't have one strong wheel, another weak wheel. They both need to be equally strong and competent.
उसके बाद कोई नहीं तो उस घर में कभी भी शांति नहीं मिलती है.
Cultures that don't respect women lose by it because half the population isn't used.
It's usually said you teach one man, you teach one person. You teach one lady, you teach the whole family.
When someone's had a stroke, you see them walking down the street and one half of their body is not working. And they're kind of dragging their leg and they're limping along and their faces, they can't talk properly, half their face is fallen. And I look and I think to myself, any society that denies that women should have equal rights is like a stroke victim.
Even in places like America, women has not reached to the top of the ladder. But whereas in other countries, small developing countries like India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, women have occupied the highest seat.
In the Hindu tradition, there's a lot of importance given to the woman because we say that the finance ministry is in the hands of Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth, and the power ministry is in the hands of goddess Durga, and the education ministry is in the hands of Saraswati. So you have finance, education, and power, all the three top portfolios held by women.
Nobody should be treated differently because of the class in which they belong, unless it's absolutely necessary. You have to treat children differently because they're smaller and vulnerable and so on like that. But if anybody could show that there's a reliable difference between men and women in some abilities, then you should treat individuals differently because of those differences in abilities, not because they're men or women. I would even take this so far as to say that we should not have an event in tennis tournaments called the men's singles. It should be called the open singles, that anybody can enter. And if a woman's good enough to beat the champion men, then she should be allowed to enter the open singles.
Should women be treated differently than men?
Well, to the extent that they are different. There are chemical differences, behavioral differences, differences in desire. Women approach mating very differently from males. Males have an inborn broadcast strategy, and much of civilization is simply about taming the male.
Women's brains think slightly differently than men's. It doesn't mean that all women are that way. I think it's good that there's women's basketball teams and men's basketball teams, for example. So I think women and men should be treated differently in that regard. If it was all one, few women would get to play professional basketball. So I think, yes, they should be treated differently in some ways.
But you'd have to talk about when and how and why. But I think it's fine. I like to be different than a man.
Well, they're equal under the law. They're very different biologically. So, yeah, we're different in a lot of ways.
People have done imaging studies and have found that there are subtle differences in the structure and function of certain parts of the brain. They're not overwhelmingly different. They're not vastly different, but they're different enough. And certainly whenever one comes across a book that delineates the differences between men and women, we do see that there are different ways in which men and women think about things, in which they respond, in which they have emotions about things. And therefore it certainly makes sense to me that the brains are different and hence need to be treated differently.
There's a verse in the Quran, in Surah Baqarah, chapter number 2, verse number 282, which says that when you involve yourself in a financial transaction involving future obligation, put it down in writing and get 2 men as witness. If you can't find 2 men, then 1 man and 2 women. Biologically, male and female are different, man and woman are different. Psychologically they're different, physically they're different. The makeup is different. So depending upon different makeup, the roles are different. In Islam, the woman is financially secured. Before a woman is married, it's the duty of the father and the brother. And after she's married, it's the duty of the husband and the son to look after lodging, boarding, clothing and all financial aspects. She need not work for a living. So in financial transaction, the man is more well versed.
Women are treated differently than men because men are in charge. That's why. If women were in charge, it would be a whole different picture. It's just power. It's no different than politics or other social systems. It's whoever has the power.
I think there is a religious persecution of women because of the fear of women. I think part of the problem is that for an incredibly long time, human society appears to have been dominated by women. Looking back for tens of thousands of years, there were matriarchal cults, and where Engels, for example, was very. He went on about the Iroquois being governed by women and what a good thing that was. And then you go and read about these horrifically sadistic people whose tortures were just about the worst you'd come to. And yes, indeed, it was a society run by women. And often when you look into mythology, you find that there appears to have been a very savage fertility cult that was directed by women. And you see an inversion of that when the Hebrew religion comes along, that what they're trying to do is get rid of the orgiastic elements of a religion, and there's a kind of Puritanism, and that becomes a suppression of women.
After the non-Indians came, the men started thinking like women were inferior, because of the Christian teachings that because man was created first and woman was created from man's rib, she was inferior. But in our Indian way, they were both equal.
Some scholars even argue that there are more than two sexes, that our insistence that there are only two is a construction that we prefer to keep society orderly and so on. And so if someone comes along who is a hermaphrodite, the doctors will immediately dive in and decide which way to do the surgery. When, as adults, the persons who have been subjected to the surgery may feel strongly that it should not have been carried out, that they should have been allowed to become whoever they were with that kind of body.
In reality, men and women are certainly different from each other. And women are generally more powerful than men. They use their sexuality wonderfully to manipulate men, and we Satanists encourage that.
How you treat a person is what they themselves demand.
I tried to leave them alone, but it doesn't work that way all the time.
Women certainly, I'm sorry.
Whenever you're ready.
I was distracted looking at that woman over there. Yes.
Is altruism or morality possible without a belief in some kind of divine being?
Oh, certainly. If there's any better proof of God, that's it. You don't have to believe in God to be altruistic.
In fact, I'd say altruism, it's been shown pretty definitively now, altruism isn't a distinctively human trait. A wonderful primatologist named Fritz de Waal has sort of shown it to be true in certain apes, but it's also true in a very primitive way of young children who empathize with their siblings or their friends, and just very simple things. I mean, the little sister is crying and little kid walks over and sort of gives her a hug, or these are altruistic acts.
Since altruism and acts of altruism have likely existed for as long as we as a species have been around, and therefore prior to all of our modern religions, it seems as though altruism can exist without a belief in God.
Altruism, for many of the evolutionary biologists, is an important survival mechanism.
Never we learn that man can cooperate more to live better. So altruism is linked with genetic endowment.
A husband comes home with flowers for his wife. So now he can do this for two reasons. He can do it because he wants his wife to cook him a nice meal. So then to whom did he bring flowers? Himself. Or he can do it because he loves his wife and he wants her to feel good. Then he did it for her.
We have to be careful on the word altruism. Let's use a different word. Can people be cooperative, nice, helpful, pro-social? Of course, we are every day. Everybody is. 99% of the things people do, atheists, agnostics, deists, pantheists, Christians, Jews, everybody does nice things most of the time.
Human beings are social creatures. We can create a civilized structure without any supernatural intervention.
I don't need to fear reprisals from a creator to act ethically.
I'm a good person, right? I mean, I've been inside a church once, I think, but I've never listened to a sermon. And I've gone to a lot of bat and bar mitzvahs, but I've never attended temple. So I'm living proof, right? I'm a nice person. I love animals.
Baba said, an honest atheist is much better than any hypocritical religious person.
But knowing God adds another dimension to you. It makes you understand why you are good.
People can live a good life without believing in the Creator, but it just makes their lives a little more difficult.
A person cannot really know about God, not be taught about God, not know Jesus Christ and not know Him by that name, and yet inside have a source of love, which I believe is God. The Bible says that Christ is the light that lighteth every man that cometh into the world.
The potential for good is in every man. You don't have to be a religious person to find it.
What we consider altruism, what we consider shyness, what we consider goodness or evil can sometimes be linked to our brain chemistry. This then is a tricky business because then it gets into the issue of who are we to blame for that behavior.
Yes, he can be good from his past life. He did good things. Naturally, his tendencies, nature will be good to do for the society.
और जो अगले धर्म को नहीं सोच रहे हैं फिर ऐसा नहीं करेगा हमारा इच्छा यही है और हमारे हर घर से वैसे हमारे जैसे
The people that don't believe in God but that are altruistic, that are kind and loving, they don't need to call it God. They don't need to read any religious books. They're already there.
国や集落によってそうですね宗教の中から定着したものそういったものがあると思うんです。だから人として生活していく中で必ず無宗教だと言ってる人間でも宗教的なものは受け入れてると思います。それが今無宗教だと言われる日本人だと思うんです。
The idea that the only reason that you're going to be good is because somebody's going to punish you if you're bad has got nothing to do with altruism. Altruism has to come from the desire to do good for its own sake. So no, there's no need to have God for there to be a morality.
So altruism, having a conscience, is a Darwinian adaptation.
I suspect so. You tend to be most altruistic to those people who are closest to you genetically, which means your children, and you tend to be less altruistic toward people who are genetically more removed from you. Almost everybody divides the world into us and them, and we have very little empathy for the them.
Once you've cultivated a compassionate character and you're actually attuned to people this way, it actually doesn't feel good. It actually feels miserable to be around people that you're making miserable, but it feels really good to be around people that you're making feel good. So that it actually, being compassionate actually makes your life better and happier. It actually contributes to your own happiness.
Couldn't you say that when someone says that they're performing a charitable act, they're actually doing something selfish because it gives them pleasure?
That's the basis of all our society. But like Mulan needed a mom, I needed a child. People would say to me, oh, you're so selfless to do that. No, it isn't. It's me wanting to be a mom. I want that experience.
If you feel good, doing good, then what you're really seeking is that good feeling.
People deny altruism because it makes you feel good. Therefore, you're not doing this unselfishly, you're doing it because it makes you feel good. To which my answer is, should you feel bad? Is a good act only good if it makes you feel bad? Or in a good universe, wouldn't being good to other people make you also feel good? Shouldn't you then get the reward of happiness for treating other people decently? You know, we've personally in our lives, we've had things that I think most reasonable people would count as losses and tragedies. We've lost 2 of our children and suffered the grief of that. But the grief that we gave and still give for the children missing from our lives is the tribute we pay to our love for them. Without the love that we had for them, we would be incapable of joy. It's all right to be good to other people, to love other people, to care for them, to do the best you can to make them happy, including sometimes being stern with them when they need it. But to devote your life to the service of others and then be happy that you did, that's all right. Altruism doesn't demand that you suffer and be miserable. What it demands is that you be looking for the good, what will work out best for the other person and give them the greatest degree of happiness. And then you should enjoy that.
I believe that every human being does have an innate conscience.
Every human being have a self-accusing spirit. Because that deep inner voice, which is the connection to God, is the same within all people.
If there is anything wrong with one's thoughts, conscience will point that out quickly enough.
Now, where that sense comes from, sense inside of you, part of it's taught by parents, by priests, by ministers, by the people we hang out with. But part of it may just be the product of cultural evolution, of thousands of years of what has worked and what hasn't worked.
Right and wrong to me is you learn. That's something that you learn when you grow up. You learn not to bite, you learn not to curse, you learn not to steal, you learn not to kill somebody.
If someone was raised to think bad was good and good was bad, then in my opinion, they'd do that. They would not question that because that's the way they'd been raised, to think bad was good and good was bad. So their conscience would tell them to do something bad because they would think it was good.
That baby was born with the instinct to grow towards God. Now, that growth can be interfered with by the mind of Satan, because Satan's mind is in the universe too.
For Satanists, we don't have a conscience because we do what we think we should be doing always.
We do all have a conscience that affirms right from wrong. We all know our moral obligation. Even a thief knows it's wrong to steal. Just try stealing from the thief.
那么根据孔子的学说，儒家学说，人之初，性本善。
When we were born, we have something that is inside us. That is the gift of the previous life, and then we have to study by our own.
We have to learn because nobody born with that discrimination. We have to learn from the scripture, from the great people of the land.
You know, there are some human beings that are born with some mental issues.
Damage to the frontal lobes can keep you from thinking in terms of the future, time binding. A lot of having a conscience is time binding. If I do this, bad things will happen and I can see them.
A baby don't have to be taught wrong. If you watch a child and that child does something at 1 year old and that child can communicate, if that child feels what it does will bring danger to him, that child will lie. No one taught that child to lie. What was in that child to teach that child to lie?
We can be pretty evil when we're children. Like I remember drowning ants. You know, that doesn't sound very nice. It's hard for me to believe I ever got a kick out of drowning ants.
There is no right or wrong apart from our relationship with the environment around us. If it connects us with that vitality that is existence, it is right.
You know, when I'm mean to someone, or rude to them, or impatient, or haughty, or any of those bad things, I torture myself about it. Not because I think God is angry with me, but because I'm going to sleep that night thinking, why was I such a jerk? Why did I do that? You know, I feel shame, but not because anyone else can see me, because I can see me, and that's the person I want to be. This is my one and only life. I don't want to mess it up.